Welcome to the Brock House here on Pepperdine University's Malibu campus. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of our Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to welcome you into the first of a three-part video series we're titling What the Ancients Taught the Founders. As America heads towards its 250th anniversary, many Americans think that the founding of the country happened just within a very short period of time, that it was a miracle in Philadelphia. But as we'll see today, many of the thoughts, beliefs, philosophies, and examples cited by the founders go back thousands of years to ancient Greece, Rome, and Sparta. In this three-part series, we'll be going over those connections between those city-states and the American founding to show that our founders had uniquely pegged that period to influence the creation of the Constitution, the writing of the Declaration of Independence, and the very formation of the United States of America. With us to discuss these topics is our Giles O'Malley Distinguished Senior Fellow, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Dr. Hanson, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to begin the first part of our discussion here by looking at the example that Greece, Rome, and Sparta sent for the American founders, why they referred back to a period that goes back 2,000 years in history, not to the Middle Ages or to other parts of human history, but specifically to that era. And I wanted to begin by citing one of the readings that you sent along to me in preparation for this. It's by the historian Richard Gumier, who wrote this about this connection between the ancients and the founders. He wrote, quote, "In no field were Greek and Roman sources more often invoked, and at no time were they more frequently cited than during the preliminary discussions, the debates on the Constitution, the ratifying conventions, the Federalist Papers, and such publications as John Dickinson's Fabius Letter. The framers of the Constitution did not merely echo or imitate this ancient material, they applied it to the task at hand." Victor, why was this era 2,000 years prior to the American founding, why was this so important to the founders?
There's two or three reasons. One is that the architects of the Constitution, Jefferson, Hamilton, John Adams, Madison, they were all schooled in classics. And by that I mean not that they didn't specialize in classics, just that if you were going to be either going to a colonial school or university, or you were going to be reading at home or tutored, the curricula were all classics. That was part of the European tradition that came out of Oxford, in the English-speaking world, out of Oxford and Cambridge. So their natural realm of reference would be these classical authors. That means, unlike today where you might read Petrarch, or you might read Machiavelli, or you might read, they were aware of these authors, but they were reading basically 5 or 6 Latin authors and 5 or 6 Greek authors, people very influential: Plutarch, Livy, Cicero, Aristotle's Politics. And out of that, the discussion of political science was everywhere, and not just political science, but the leaders of representative governments. So they were familiar with that. The second reason, very quickly, is when you look at the period from 650 BC until their present, 1788, 1789, the aberration was constitutional or consensual government. There had been this period from 650 in Greece, BC, to the end of the city-state as a free entity, destroyed, I think, by Alexander the Great in the 330s. And then in Rome, you had the Roman Republic from 753, but it was ending, so you had about 1,000 years to draw on. But then when you look at the Dark Ages, or even the Byzantine Empire, or what was left of the Renaissance, you had republican government in very few places. The Papal States, maybe, not really, but Florence, Venice, but there's no Italian nation that is democratic. And then you have the British gradual parliamentary system, but they still had monarchy. So when they were fighting against monarchy. That's the third reason. So put it all together, and these founders said, we're fighting against monarchy. And who did that the best? And what's the example we're most familiar with? It's Greece and Rome.
So when we think about those three city-states, when we think about Greece, Athens, Sparta, and Rome, let's pull those apart just to set the foundation for the conversation. Why would Greece and Athens be seen as a relevant example? And as we'll get into, it's not that they saw this, the founders necessarily saw these regions as, or civilizations as ones to replicate or duplicate. They also saw cautionary tales in each of their stories. We'll get to that in a second. But what attracted them as examples to establishing this republic?
When they were studying classics, it's kind of an age before archaeology, epigraphy, that we have a wider spectrum of the 1500 city-states. But even today, that period, Pericles, let's say from 459 BC to 429 BC, the golden age of Greece, not just the golden age of Athens. That's when the Athenian Empire was at its height, before the ruinous Peloponnesian War. So what was happening in that city that the founders looked for? Well, they were reading, I don't think they may have been reading Aristophanes' plays or Sophocles or Euripides' tragedies, but mostly they were probably getting it secondhand from Plutarch's Lives of Plutarch, or Plutarch's Life of Cleon, or Plutarch's Life of Alcibiades. They may have read Thucydides, probably through a translation through Latin. Jefferson said he could read it in Greek. And they had read Herodotus. So what the picture they got was, at this 30-year period, you could be walking in this town of 100,000 people and you'd bump into Socrates, who was emblemized in Plato's dialogues. So they knew that. And then they knew that Pericles was this singular ruler that was elected every year. And they knew something about the Acropolis appears everywhere. So they knew there was this the most perfect Greek temple, the Parthenon. Then the Erechtheum was being built, and the Propylaea. At the same time, the theater of Dionysus in this period we're talking about were producing in 2 festivals a year Aeschylus, Oresteia, Sophocles, Oedipus, Antigone, Euripides, Bacchae, Medea. While this was going on, Aristophanes was making fun of people, and Lysistrata, that was a later play, but let's say Acharnians or some of the earlier plays that we've lost. And that's not mentioning all the authors, and the great orators, Lysias, and later Demosthenes after this period. But the point I'm making is 90% of the classical literature they were reading was ethnocentric. The other thing that was very important to realize is, and that was a product of a constitutional, well, actually, that's kind of an archaic word because they didn't have a written constitution, but a consensual government. Later on, you can point out that they were afraid of that type of consensual government, but they acknowledged it was dynamic, that when you empowered the people of Athens, every citizen of Athens could vote in the ecclesia. And they had all these veto powers of ostracism and antidosis, all this stuff. Then there created an energy, and that energy was manifested with this huge fleet, this indomitable military power, great men like Socrates or Pericles or Sophocles, and these monumental architecture and art. So it was something they wanted to emulate.
And did they see a direct connection between the freedoms afforded by these republican, or at least consensual governments, and the flourishing of arts and sciences? do you think the founders necessarily saw that connection as well, that there was actually a culture that could be created?
I think at the beginning they did, because, I mean, they were aware that the scientific method, say, of Democritus, the atomic theory, he was a close associate of Pericles, and he was operating in that confine. And we know from other information there were not just Plato, but there were worldly philosophers that were worried about earth, fire, air, and scientific investigations. Aristotle himself is one later. So they were aware that this democratic government was highly unstable, highly dangerous, but the spirit of getting the body politic active, engaged in politics, allowed for great art, great architecture, and great science. So they wanted to emulate Athens, that energy, but they did not want to, as we'll probably talk about, they did not want to emulate democratic government.
And so as we think about these three ancient examples of Greece, Rome, and Sparta, the readings that you had sent earlier seem to highlight, on the positive side, they liked, just as you said, the founders really were attracted to the flourishing culture, in many ways the diffusion of power. They liked that as it related to Greece. They liked, in a little bit later, and we'll get into how some of these feelings about these ancient cultures changed over time through the founding, but they liked the republican form of government, the rule of law and order that was presented by Rome. And in Sparta, they liked the civic nature, the broader cultural commitments toward the nation. At the same time, they saw the inverse of these two. They saw, as you also said, that there was too much democracy at points when it came to Athens. There was maybe too much of a stretch toward empire and restrictions when it came to Rome, and they saw the militarism in Sparta. Talk a bit about these different qualities of these three civilizations.
Well, we mentioned the dynamism that attracted the founders about Athens, and that was very important in their sense of classical architecture. When you look at the buildings that later followed in Washington, D.C., or the statuary or the art, that they were trying to emulate sort of a city on the hill or the Athenian golden age. But they were very aware of some iconic incidents in Athenian history. They had known that the Athenian people had, not the oligarchs, but the radical democracy and the popular courts had executed Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, for speaking his mind. They were aware in the text of Thucydides, which they were aware of probably through a translation, but there was also elements in Plutarch and other authors that they had engineered this disastrous Sicilian expedition, that they had sailed into the island of Melos and slaughtered the adult males under the idea of democratic imperialism, that they ruined their golden age by bringing everybody into the walls, fighting with Sparta and having this disastrous plague, that they went into the island of Mytilene and executed the adult males. So I could go on, but these incidents scared them, and they were aware of Xenophon as well. Xenophon has some pretty vivid descriptions of what this democracy was like. It was sort of like anybody could make a motion. So I think you have violated the rules of assembly protocol, and you I want to ostracize, and you I want to condemn. And then it was kind of like the French revolutionary spirit. And they had seen, the revolution in France was following, but they had seen turmoil in Europe as well. And they felt that it was more Athenian than it should be. When they looked at Sparta, a couple of things. the Spartan constitution is praised throughout classical literature, mostly by, most classical writers are from the elite classes, but they felt that it was a mixed constitution. It was famously in Polybius and in Plato and other political writers that the Roman perfect system came from Crete and then to Sparta. And they said it was, the beauty of it, it was stable, and it avoided extremes of wealth and poverty. And by that, it was sort of what influenced Montesquieu via Rome. There was an executive branch, there was two executives, and you can see where the consuls came from the Europontid family of kings and the Aegids, and that balanced them. And then there was the legislative branch, and this was the popular assembly of every Spartan citizen, about 10,000. They called that the ecclesia, which is a word throughout the city-states. And then there was the Senate, the older, smaller, and more powerful body, the Gerousia. That's the Greek word for Senate. And then there were tribunals, the judicial, and those were the ephorates and some minor judges. And they all balanced power, and that was very influential in Rome, and the founders knew it came from Sparta. And then in contrast to Athens, although Sparta had no money, no monumental architecture, no beautiful history of art or sculpture, at least comparative to the other city-states and Athens in particular. But they had this wonderful army, this very deadly, but I guess we would call it a popular militia. And they had done things that saved Greece. At Thermopylae, they held off the Persian army for 3 days. They were the ones that won the Battle of Plataea for all of Greece. They won the Peloponnesian War against the Athenians. They actually won it with the help of Persia and Thebes and other powers. But the founders said, well, this was the most stable of all of them. And it had the most effective army, and it had the best constitution, and it had the most influence on Rome, which lasted 700 years as a republic and another 500 years as an empire. And therefore, we're going to adopt that system, and we like Sparta. However, they were not stupid. They were men of intellect and artistic interest, and they looked at it and they said, but it was also not a dynamic, artistic, architectural, philosophical place. There's not a great poem. There's some poets, but not great. There's
not
no
a great
history.
culture. In that
Yeah, there's
sense.
no Herodotus. There's no
Right.
Thucydides. There's no Sophocles. There's no that kind. And so they thought they were trying to capture the zeitgeist of Athens and the spirit and the dynamism and control it within the framework of Sparta. And they came up with, or they didn't come up with, but from antiquity, they got the answer that Rome was the answer. The Roman system solved the problem.
Now, we touched on it, but I think it's worth drilling down upon as we think about not just the founders, but that founding generation, what America was like in the 18th century. And you've touched upon the importance of the founders and their education. There are a couple points in some of the readings that you have given us that highlight that many of the references that founders would use to the ancients, whether it's in art or history, were in some ways akin to something else we've studied at Pepperdine, which is the use of the Hebrew scriptures by the founders as metaphors. But they were only used because they understood that their audience, the American public, had a sense of what those were. So while elite in some ways, talk a little bit about the education of the founders and broadly Americans, and why the use of these stories and metaphors in the founding taken from 2,000 years ago were seen as creating kind of a common language that not only the founders understood, but also the Americans they were looking to lead.
Well, their education, whether formal or informal, was based on the cultures of three great cities. From Jerusalem, they got the Judeo-Christian system. And even if some of the founders, maybe Washington or Hamilton, were not actively observant, it's very hard to find any of them that were declared agnostics or atheists. They were maybe a good term would be deist. In other words, they understood that Christianity, the Sermon on the Mount, the New Testament, and the stories of the Old Testament inculcated a moral code, and that was essential for the American people. And yet they were quite aware of the schisms in Europe, the 30 Years' War, all of that, bloodletting, and the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. So they were insistent that there would not be a national religion, but they would imbue their currency, their mottos with references to God and Declaration of Independence. So that was one pillar of this triad. And then in their reading, Sparta came up, and if you look at classical literature, you have this great speech by Pericles of the difference between the Spartan and the Athenian constitution, but in that same historian Thucydides, you get the impression that most Greeks thought Sparta was preferable, even though they understood. So they felt that in their reading, they kept coming across the idea of a mixed constitution. Especially, he's kind of an obscure person today, but the historian Polybius that wrote about the Punic Wars, Rome versus Carthage, he has a long excursus where he asks the question, how did Rome become so powerful? And he basically says it did not adopt a radical democracy, but it created a republican, that res publica, the public thing, from the Cretan and Greek model. And that they improved upon it, and they made a mixed constitution. They had two consuls like the Spartans, but they weren't hereditary. They had to be of the senatorial class, but they were elected. There was a slate of candidates that were approved, and then you had an election. And then there was the Senate and the popular tribunals. So you had something like our House of Representatives and the Senate, and then they had tribunals, courts, a court system or a Supreme Court. So when the founders created the Constitution, they thought, we have to have a flavor of Judeo-Christianity, but we're not going to have a mandated state religion. We're going to have freedom of speech, unlike the Spartans. We're going to have what we could call it pararesia or isagoria. Those are Greek words they got from the idea of free speech and the ability to say what you please. That come from Athens, and that would be inculcated in the Bill of Rights. But we're not going to go radically in the Athenian direction where everybody just gets up and speaks. There's no written constitution, there's no blinders, there's no parameters, there's no sidelines. And you can accuse people or ostrich. We're not going to have the Athenian hatred of the rich and the aristocracy. And so we're going to adopt the Roman model, which was also in reaction to that. And that explains why so many of the Federalists, when they quote things, in passing they'll be very critical of Athens, but they seem to be drawing mostly on Aristotle or Cicero. And I think their education, that was the only reference. And everybody would say, well, why didn't they talk about, as you said, the Middle Ages? Well, there's no example really of a consensual system. Maybe the Magna Carta. Why not the Renaissance? Well, there's the Florentine Republic and there's the Venetian Republic and a few other, but there's not 1,500 city-states as there was in Athens. One thing that they were also worried about is the idea of equality of result. That came from Athens, and they were very skeptical of these wealthy people having to forcibly pay for ships or forcibly have their fortune taken away if they were ostracized, or somebody of the poor could lodge a complaint against them, and then if he was successful in a trial, switch net worth. And so there was all these and there was probably 20,000 Athenians in the Athenian government. So they liked the freedom of speech, but they wanted to avoid that, and they got that avoidance from Rome.
One of the interesting aspects, and you kind of touched on this, was that there was not only a transition in how these different city-states were viewed by the founders, but also that different founders viewed them in different ways. This also was another quotation from the historian Gumir and his piece on this connection between the ancients and the founders. Quote, "Throughout the colonial period, a preference was expressed for the Greek concept of a colony with its freedom from the domination of the mother city. Arguments pro or con culminated in the question whether the Articles of Confederation were sufficient for national purposes." And just as you were saying, Victor, this change from the focus on Greece and Athens, that as we moved from the period of being colonies to being a nation, as we transitioned from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the Federalists that obviously were moving the Constitution forward were distancing themselves from the example of Athens and moving much more towards Rome. So talk a bit about that transition.
Well, whether you were a Hamiltonian or an Adams Federalist, or you were an anti-Federalist, sort of like Jefferson, you were still using the same allusions and references and knowledge of the ancient world. And so the Articles of Confederation was based more on a Hellenic model. And there were 1,500 city-states, and among them they had various leagues, the Boeotian Confederation or the Arcadian League, where you'd get 10 or 20 city-states and a prominent city in the middle. And then they had loose affiliations and alliances. The Federalists said this whole model never worked very well. Alexander just put it down, and they could never unite. Even when they were threatened by the Persians, they were saved at the last moment, but they never had a word in their vocabulary for nation. The Federalists said this, and there is a good example, and that's Rome. And they were able to take the city-state model of Italy and federate it into a nation. And that's why it became not just a good place like Athens or the Greeks, or a great place of literature and Virgil and Horace and Ovid, but they knew how to build roads. They knew they had a wonderful army like the Spartan army. And that is the model we're doing. Of course, the Anti-Federalists said, well, they took over the whole world. The system was so effective and they were so warlike, and there was not enough free Athenian, Jefferson especially, there was not enough feedback, and there was not enough consensuality, and there was not enough agrarianism. They had this 1 million person monstrosity of Rome, and they killed these people. And they would quote all of these very famous passages. There's a British Calcagus, the famous Scottish national, said, "You people, these Romans are very strange people. They come in and make a desert and they call it peace." And we have the same thing from the Carthaginians. We'll say that about the Romans. And that was part of the Jeffersonian worry about the Constitution, that it was going to take all of these individual cultures, these city-states, a Virginia or a New York or a Pennsylvania, and it was going to suppress their identities as city-states and put them in this Roman anonymous world power. So there was a compromise, and the Anti-Federalists lost the Articles of Confederation, thank God, but they were able to have certain things in the Constitution, like the 10th Bill of Rights. Any power the federal government doesn't have is relegated to the states. Or the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the the Federalist had Article 6 of the Constitution, where it says, in matters of jurisdiction, if federal officers are enforcing federal law, that takes supremacy over state law. So they were very concerned, the Anti-Federalists, that states would act individually and autonomously, and they would represent agrarianism, and especially in the case of Jefferson, and they would maintain these unique, disparate cultures, and that would prevent a uniform Roman imperial dominance and imperialism. And then, of course, the Federalists said, okay, we'll compromise with you, but you have to have a strong national executive, a consul, and you have to have the federal law supreme to the state, or you're going to have something that is going to be our worst nightmare. We're going to be on this North American continent, and we'll have 50 or 60 nations. And if we do that, we'll be just like Greece, or better yet, we're going to be like Europe. And Europe is fighting all the time. That was what they were very afraid of. They looked back at European history and said, England, France, they're all fighting because there's not a uniform culture. And so that was the compromise in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
And in some ways, it was kind of a compromise between these three examples.
I think it was a compromise between the Greek model of independent entities forming a loose confederation that was be protective of these identities that were so rich and different, but ultimately failed in Greece and would fail in the United States because there was no strong dominant binder or glue that held them together. And so they looked to Rome for that.
Last question. One of the interesting aspects of another reading that you had provided from the historian Edwin Miles talks about the American history as it related to these references to the ancients, that by the time that we moved beyond the founding generation, many of these references, either directly or metaphorically, were lost in the American context for some specific reasons. And I wanted to quote this from Miles. Quote, by the middle of the 19th century, most Americans no longer regarded the Republican eras of Greece and Rome as constituting a golden age in man's history. Talk a bit about how culturally, after the founding and after all this incredible influence on not only American culture, but also our very Republican institutions, that influence began to fade as we moved into the 1800s.
Yeah, I think the big was the Jacksonian Revolution. So after Washington and Adams and Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, John Quincy Adams, you had the revolution of Andrew Jackson. And that was somebody who did not come out of that elite Eastern Seaboard, classical educated perspective. And more importantly, that was a time where the United States was growing dynamically. It won the War of 1812. And there was a sense that people started to think of manifest destiny, and there was something unique about the American drive, and they no longer needed to be lectured or told by a bunch of older East Coast people about what consisted of education. And the other thing that was happening, especially by the 1850s and 60s, people were starting to divorce. Class was no longer, as it was in Europe, based on birth. So you were starting to see people that were making cotton gins, or they were starting to make factories, first powered by water and then coal, and they were making so much more money, and they were so much wealthier than the great landed estates of the East Coast. So in their way of thinking, at least in the North, and this is what we can talk about in subsequent interviews, the South, where there was less industrialization and there was more of a Roman latifundia and a Scotch-Irish aristocracy, and more importantly, as they constantly pointed out, there was no mainstream condemnation of slavery in the ancient world. We can talk why that was next time, but they became a receptacle of classical education. So Basil Gildersleeve, who was kind of the founder of American classics, he founded the American Philological Association in some ways, from John Hopkins and everything. He owned slaves. And so, to sum up, as they expanded west and they created the Industrial Revolution, people said, we are Americans. And now, by 1865, 1870, we had a higher GDP than Great Britain and Germany. So the idea was, we don't need European influence. We don't need the classical. We've done things they've never even dreamed of. We're wealthier. We have more power. We have better roads. We have better railroads in Europe. And we better inculcate in our youth practical things like science and vocational education. And we should not mandate Latin to go to universities. And by 1910, I think that was pretty much over, 1920. So it was a populist revolution against the aristocracy, and part of that was the classical tradition was seen more and more as an artifact of a vanishing class. And when you get people like in the late 19th century, like the Mellons or the Guggenheims or Carnegie, and then Henry Ford and all of these people, the Gilded Age, and then America just took off. And it was a populist revolution.
Well, Victor, that seems like a perfect note to end this conversation in. Thanks so much for this first part of our three-part discussion. As we go into our next two, we'll look more into the philosophies and philosophers and political leaders of ancient Greece, Rome, and Sparta, and why they were so influential on the American founders. As we conclude this session, I wondered if you could just, we've ended this one by talking about this transition away from studying the classics. You have taught the classics here at Pepperdine, and specifically looking at leaders, both military and political, from that era, and teaching our current policymakers at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine. Why do you think it's so important that we continue to teach the relevance of that period to today?
I think there's three reasons. Practically, the first, we're seeing a radical decline in analytical skills of students, the ability to speak well and to write well. And just one semester of Latin will teach you the structure of grammar. 2 semesters will teach you the advantages of short versus long sentences, compound versus simple sentences, monotonous vocabulary versus a rich vocabulary. So it really creates a discipline in written and oral expression. The second thing is, whether we like it or not, I know we're a multicultural, multiracial society, but almost all of our references are still Judeo-Christian European. And so once you take 2 or 3 classical courses, when you go to Washington, you can say, that's a Doric column, that's a Corinthian column. You can look at your own currency and, e pluribus unum, from many, one. Right. Annuit coeptus, he nods on our great beginnings, on the dollar bill. Novo ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. You don't have to say, well, that comes from the 4th Eclogue of Virgil. You get a sense of where this country came from, and you get a sense of, we do have a legislative body, we do have an executive body, we do have a judicial body, and you know what the difference of the Declaration, and you can see the classical framework of all that. So that's important. The third is, and these are practical reasons, I think, as well, but The third is that part of it is the nature of the survival of classical literature. Only 7 to 10% survive. But all of the great issues that we deal with as humans in civilization are discussed in a very brilliant, analytical, and non-ideological context. There is no DEI, there is no political correctness. People just write and say what they want. And so what are those issues? How do you deal in a society where women can't vote with women who are smarter than men, like Antigone or Medea? Why do men, when they turn 45, want a trophy wife, like Jason and Medea? Why, when you tell people something that they know is true and they know that it's incriminating, why do they want to kill you, like they did Socrates? How can a society of sober people get all revved up and want to go 900 miles away to Sicily and a crazy idea, which was the Sicilian expedition? And he has a brilliant, Thucydides does, description of popular fervor. And Herodotus says at one time, you know, it's much easier to convince 30,000 Athenians in the assembly to go way over to Ionia and fight than it is a few sober-minded old men at Sparta and an oligarchy. So what I'm getting, I could go on, and then why is it that when we get old, you start thinking of death much more than when you're young? If you read Euripides' Alcestis, where he says, you're young, and the god said, if I can get somebody to die for me, you can take my place. And the argument back from Admet is, do you think that young people don't like the sun on their face every morning? So aging is another. Solon is, it also overturns our stereotypes. So we are told that being old is, that's when you're wise and you're retired. Your golden years, they don't have the word golden years. 7 ages of man, from 1 to 70, and you're decrepit, you're old, you're wrinkled, you're unattractive. And and it's not that they're criticizing old age, but they're just telling you it's tragic you get old. We think in terms of sexual harassment that young people, like say if you're a 20-year-old girl and you're in a class and some guy winks at you or the professor winks at you, then you're going to file a sexual harassment suit. The ancients think that youth has all the cards. They are the pretty ones, they're the energetic ones, they're the manipulative ones. And so when you read Petronius' Satyricon and the Pergamum Boy or any of these stories, Milesian tales, it's always some conniving person that appeals to some torn up, decrepit old person and says, if you're handsome, right? But they all want something. Right. And that just turns topsy-turvy over ours, but it's a different point of view. And it's closer to human nature, I think. And why do we like people like Alexander or Pericles why does half the country like Trump? And that is that when people can get things done and they're dynamic and they have a sense of vision, we tend to overlook some of the bad things they do and their personal shortcomings, because actions speak louder than words sometimes. So all of the great issues that we deal with as human beings were first, and I think most successfully explained and analyzed by classical authors. It's not, there were soap opera authors, there was gossip authors, there was gossip column, Athenea, but they don't survive or we don't read them anymore. And I think when you go to PhD in classics, you read thousands of pages of Greek and Latin in the original languages, but you're probably not going to read more than 20% of the 7% that survives. So there was a natural winning out process that I think kept most of the best. There's a parlor game with classicists is, oh, I wish I had Aristotle's Poetics. Or just think if I had 106 plays of Sophocles. I'm not sure that would be a good thing because some of them weren't very good. But anyway, I think anybody who reads classical literature will see in Sophocles, Euripides, Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, Sappho, that they're always talking about great things, great issues that are going to affect their own lives. I had a student that came to me and said, the more I like this girl and the more I give her stuff, the less she likes me. And I said, I pointed out 3 or 4 places in classical literature where that is very common, that, or another person said, I don't understand my neighbor. I was farming and a guy said to me, the more I lend him my tractor, the more he hates me. And that's a common theme that, and the idea of nemesis and karma. So if you look at all this lawfare going on right now, that Trump is indicted 91 times, and then people are shocked that John Brennan or Comey or John Bolton might have exposure legally, and that might be connected with Trump's own sense of retribution. They should read about the temple of Ramnus that was honored the goddess Nemesis. And when hubris, arrogance, will ultimately, if it's unchecked, it will draw the attention of a divine power called Nemesis that oversees everything. And so the attitude is, play it down, don't press it. A lot of cultures have that. What comes around goes around, karma, but it's best expressed, I think, in classical literature.
Thanks very much for this first of 3 conversations, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I enjoyed it.
Thanks.